This is the house that in 1976, Barbara Ann Garcia was found brutally murdered in. 48 years later, the Amarillo Police Department has finally been able to give the family some peace.
It was December 14th, 1976, a date etched into the minds of Amarillo's residents. Just over a week before Christmas, the air was filled with the usual festive excitement. Streets were lit up, houses were being decorated, and families were preparing for the joy that was just around the corner. But behind the doors of one quiet suburban home, something unimaginable was about to unfold. A young mother, 21-year-old Barbara Ann Garcia, was home alone with her baby daughter. By morning, Barbara would be found brutally murdered in her own backyard, leaving behind a shattered family and a community gripped with fear. How could something so violent happen in such a peaceful neighborhood? Who would commit such a senseless act against a young mother, leaving her baby alone for nearly 24 hours? The answers to these questions would remain a mystery for nearly 5 decades, until a shocking breakthrough finally revealed the truth, but with a twist no one saw coming. But before we dive deeper into the mystery, I'd like to ask for a small favor. The statistics show that more than 70% of you watching aren't subscribed to the channel yet. If you're enjoying these deep dives into true crime and want to stay updated on future cases, please consider subscribing. It really helps the channel grow and ensures you don't miss out on any new videos. Now, without further ado, let's get back to the case. Barbara, a young mother of a 5-month-old daughter named Natasha, lived a seemingly peaceful life on North Magnolia Street. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other, where doors were left unlocked, and safety was rarely questioned. Little did anyone know that sense of security was about to be shattered in the most brutal way possible. On that quiet December evening, Barbara found herself home alone with her infant daughter, unaware of the dark figure lurking just outside her door, a figure that would bring unimaginable horror to her doorstep. Her husband was away, leaving Barbara to attend to the needs of baby Natasha. The day had passed without incident, with no signs of impending danger. The baby had likely drifted off to sleep in the nursery, and for Barbara, it was just another evening in the routine of motherhood. But routine was violently broken when an unknown assailant crept into the house, turning what was once a safe haven into the site of a vicious and unforgivable crime. Who was this person? And more importantly, why did they choose this night, this house, and this young mother? These are the questions that would haunt investigators, the family, and the entire community for years to come. But for Barbara, those answers came too late. What occurred next was a savage attack, one that stunned everyone who would later hear the details. Barbara's body was found in the backyard, lifeless, cold, and marred by blunt force trauma. The brutality of the crime was staggering. Whoever had done this had struck her multiple times, leaving no doubt that this was a crime born of rage. Was it personal, or was it random? The absence of a clear motive added a sinister layer to the case. Whoever had done this was still out there, free to potentially strike again. But the most heart-wrenching detail of all? Baby Natasha, just 5 months old, had been left inside the house, completely alone for nearly 24 hours. She was unharmed, physically at least, but had spent an entire day and night abandoned, unaware of the horror that had unfolded just outside the walls of her nursery. Can you imagine that? A tiny infant, crying for her mother, while just outside, her mother lay dead in the cold December night. It wasn't until Barbara's family, growing concerned after not hearing from her, decided to check on her that they made the grim discovery. Her lifeless body was found in the backyard, while little Natasha remained inside, likely crying and confused, wondering why her mother never came back. The discovery was beyond tragic. It was horrifying. The image of that scene would stay with the family, the investigators, and the entire community for years to come. This wasn't just any crime, It was an atrocity that shook Amarillo to its core. In a town where violent crime was rare, the brutal murder of a young mother in what seemed like a safe suburban home left everyone in fear. Could their homes no longer protect them? Could anyone be safe? These were the questions echoing through the minds of every resident. As the community struggled to make sense of what had happened, one thing was certain. The killer had left behind more than just a crime scene. They had left behind a nightmare. And until they were caught, the people of Amarillo would never feel safe again. The investigation began immediately after Barbara's body was discovered. The Amarillo Police Department responded swiftly, knowing that the clock was ticking. With a young mother brutally murdered and her infant daughter found alone inside the home, the sense of urgency was overwhelming. This wasn't just any crime. This was the kind of heinous act that could send shockwaves through any community. The police knew they had to act fast. If the killer was still on the loose, there was a very real fear that they might strike again. As investigators arrived on the scene, they were greeted by the gruesome sight of Barbara's lifeless body lying in the backyard. The brutality of the crime was evident from the start. Blunt force trauma, the kind that leaves no room for doubt. This was no accidental death, no random injury. Someone had attacked Barbara with a level of violence that sent chills down the spines of even the most seasoned officers. Her body bore the unmistakable signs of a vicious, frenzied attack, one that likely ended as quickly as it had begun. Inside the home, the discovery of baby Natasha, alive but alone, only added a deeper layer of tragedy to the case. How had the killer managed to leave the child unharmed? Had they simply not noticed her, or was it a deliberate choice to leave the baby untouched? These were the kinds of questions racing through the minds of investigators, but with so little to go on, they had no answers. All they knew was that they had to solve this case, and quickly. However, this was 1976, long before the age of DNA profiling or advanced forensic science. Modern tools like touch DNA or genetic genealogy, which might have solved the case in a matter of days today, were still decades away from being developed. The investigators were left with only the traditional crime-solving methods of the time: witness statements, physical evidence, and old-fashioned detective work. And while those methods had solved many cases, they were no match for the challenges this case presented. The first priority was clear: secure the crime scene and gather every piece of evidence they could find. Investigators meticulously combed through the backyard and the home, collecting fingerprints, fibers, and any other trace evidence they could spot. Every detail mattered. Even the smallest fragment could hold the key to solving the case. The team worked tirelessly, knowing that the fate of the investigation rested on what they could uncover in those first crucial hours. Neighbors were questioned relentlessly. Investigators needed to know, had anyone seen or heard anything out of the ordinary that night? Were there any unfamiliar faces in the neighborhood? Any suspicious vehicles parked on the street? But despite their best efforts, the leads they had hoped for simply didn't materialize. Witnesses reported little to nothing out of the ordinary. No strange figures lurking in the shadows. No suspicious cars idling nearby. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace behind. For the town of Amarillo, this was a wake-up call. Violent crime wasn't something they were used to. The idea that someone could break into a quiet suburban home, savagely murder a young mother, and leave a helpless baby behind, it was unthinkable. This wasn't just another crime. It was the kind of crime that haunts people's nightmares. The sheer brutality of the murder created a wave of fear that swept through the entire community. If it could happen to Barbara in her own home, what was stopping it from happening again? Who could feel safe anymore? Every locked door felt a little less secure, and every shadow a little more menacing. Despite the fear gripping the town, the police were left with very little to go on. There were no immediate suspects, no glaringly obvious clues pointing to the murderer. The brutality of the crime spoke of deep rage, possibly even personal hatred, but without any solid leads. Those theories remain just that, theories. As the days stretched on, the investigators worked around the clock, but the case wasn't getting any easier. Every potential lead either dried up or led to dead ends. Barbara's family was left with no answers as to who had committed such a heinous act, and, more painfully, no explanation as to why. Despite the best efforts of the detectives, there was simply no solid evidence that could point them in the direction of a suspect. Frustratingly, without modern technology, the investigators were limited in their ability to analyze the crime scene evidence. For example, while they may have collected blood samples, hair, or other biological material from the scene, they couldn't match it to a specific person without DNA testing, a technique that wouldn't become widely available for criminal cases until the late 1980s. This meant that much of the evidence collected was effectively unusable, in leading to an arrest at the time. As the case grew colder, it became one of Amarillo's most frustrating unsolved murders. The community, along with Barbara's family, held on to the hope that one day her killer would be found. But as time passed, that hope slowly faded. By the 1980s and 1990s, the case had grown into an old file, sitting on a shelf with other cold cases that had gone unsolved for decades. The detectives who had worked the case originally moved on, some retiring without ever seeing justice for Barbara's family. Every few years, a new detective might open the file, hoping that something would stand out, that some overlooked clue would give them the breakthrough they needed. But nothing came. Without new evidence or leads, the case remained in limbo, cold and unsolved. Nevertheless, everything changed in 2022 when the Amarillo Police Department established a dedicated cold case unit. This unit was specifically designed to revisit old, unsolved crimes with a fresh perspective and the help of new technology. By now, advances in forensic science, particularly DNA profiling, had transformed the way investigators approached cold cases. What once seemed impossible, solving a case decades after the crime, had become achievable thanks to modern tools that were not available during the original investigation. The Texas Rangers Cold Case Unit got involved in Barbara's case in 2023, reigniting the investigation that had been dormant for nearly 5 decades. The team reviewed all the old evidence collected back in 1976, including items from the crime scene that had been carefully stored for years. In June 2023, they resubmitted key pieces of evidence to the Texas Department of Public Safety, hoping that new DNA analysis techniques could reveal something previously hidden. The big break came when forensic experts analyzed DNA from a pair of shoes collected at the scene back in 1976. In the 1970s, DNA testing wasn't a part of criminal investigations, so the shoes had been preserved in evidence storage for decades without being analyzed in any meaningful way. Now, with modern DNA technology, the team was able to extract a viable DNA sample and run it through national databases. In August 2024, nearly 48 years after the cold-blooded murder of Barbara Ann Garcia, a breakthrough finally came, a breakthrough that many believed would never happen. Decades of frustration, dead ends, and unanswered questions seemed to culminate in this one pivotal moment. A DNA match had been found, pointing to a single name: Billie Jean Cummings. At 73 years old, Cummings was a resident of Tucson, Arizona, a man who had evaded justice for almost half a century. For the investigators and Barbara's family, it felt like the impossible had finally been achieved. After all these years, they had their answer. But just as the case seemed poised for resolution, it took a cruel and devastating twist. In an ironic and bitter twist of fate, Cummings had died several years earlier. The man who had been responsible for so much suffering would never stand trial for Barbara's murder. He would never have to face the consequences of his horrific actions. Billie Jean Cummings was no stranger to violence. He had already been serving time in an Arizona prison for the murder of another woman in Phoenix, a predator hidden in plain sight. He had been a free man for years after Barbara's murder, capable of committing more atrocities. When investigators unearthed this shocking revelation, the bitter realization hit hard. Cummings had passed away behind bars, taking with him the opportunity for the Garcia family to see him brought to justice. The case, long unsolved, had seemingly reached its conclusion, but not in the way anyone had hoped. For Natasha Garcia, Barbara's daughter, the news brought an overwhelming mix of emotions. For almost 50 years, she had carried the weight of her mother's tragic death. She had lived her entire life with one singular hope: to one day face the man responsible and demand answers. Now, that hope was shattered. There would be no day in court, no opportunity to confront the man who had stolen her mother from her. Justice, it seemed, had slipped through her fingers once again, leaving behind only questions that would never be answered. Imagine living your entire life, hoping and waiting for closure, only to have it slip away in the cruelest of ways. Natasha had been a mere infant at the time of her mother's death, left alone in the house for nearly 24 hours, unaware of the horror just outside. As the years passed, the pain of losing her mother remained, a wound that time could not heal. Now, in 2024, when it seemed like justice was finally within reach, the man responsible was already gone. How do you process something like that? The news was a double-edged sword. On one hand, they finally knew who had taken Barbara's life. The question that had haunted Natasha for decades, who, was now answered. But the answer offered little comfort. It was too late. Cummings had died, his secrets buried with him. For the Garcia family, this moment felt like a cruel twist of fate. Justice delayed, and ultimately, justice denied. Natasha expressed her deep frustration and sorrow, stating that while the identity of her mother's killer was now known, it did little to ease the pain of knowing that he had escaped the consequences of his actions. Natasha had yearned for the chance to look her mother's murderer in the eye, to ask him why. Why had he brutally taken her mother's life? Why had he left her alone in that house, an infant with no one to care for her? But now, those questions would forever remain unanswered. For Natasha, this was the hardest pill to swallow. The fact that after nearly 5 decades, the closure she had longed for would never truly come. Meanwhile, for the Amarillo Police Department, the case was considered officially closed. However, the resolution, though remarkable from a forensic standpoint, brought little solace to those most affected by the crime. The breakthrough in Barbara Ann Garcia's case stands as a testament to the power of modern forensic science, while also serving as a reminder that justice delayed can sometimes feel like justice denied. But, even with the case officially closed, one question lingers: was justice truly served? While modern forensic science finally revealed the truth, the man responsible for Barbara's murder escaped any real consequences. How would you feel if you were in Natasha's shoes, knowing your mother's killer will never face trial? Do you think justice delayed is justice denied in this case? Or is knowing the truth, after all these years, enough for closure? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to share your opinions on this heart-wrenching case. If you've made it this far, we'd really appreciate it if you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you never miss another gripping true crime story like this one. Your support helps us continue bringing these important cases to light. Thank you for watching,